So this question is, does the Bible say anything about seed retention? Seed retention, from my understanding, is basically where one will abstain from sexual activity for a period of time. Firstly, there are insights where people ultimately were abstaining. From a biblical perspective, if you're a Christian and you're single, then you should be basically not engaging in any of those kind of activities, right? You shouldn't be taking part in fornication. You shouldn't be masturbating. You shouldn't do any of these different kind of things. For whatever, like, you may have other reasons why you don't want to do that, right? But the Bible is encouraging single individuals not to do that, right? Just right from the get-go. So if you want to consider that as some sort of seed retention, then there you go, right? But that's obviously grounded in what God has ultimately set up. From a married perspective, right? Obviously, the Bible, from a married perspective, God obviously created marriage for companionship, for procreation, for enjoyment, etc. Men and women are free to enjoy however they please, right? But there are examples in the Bible where even married couples are separated for a particular time, right? And the most famous examples, there's an example in Exodus, right? Where God is basically coming to meet the people, and God ultimately says, don't come to your wives, right? It's just basically using like a figure of speech to a certain degree to say, don't basically have intercourse with your wife. The reason that is because under the Old Testament law, the Torah, if you release seed, it was you were unclean ceremonially, right? So if God is ultimately coming to the people, then if you've basically taken part in those particular activities, you'll be ceremonially unclean. In 1 Corinthians 7, Paul is talking about husbands and wives, right? You can't keep yourself away from your partner. You can't say, look, you're not getting any, and the wife can't say you're not getting any, the husband can't say you're not getting any, right? The only way that can run is when both are in agreement and have both decided, you know what, we're going to take a break for a season and then ultimately come back together and take care of business, basically do what you have to do. In 1 Samuel, when David is on the run from King Saul, he goes to Nob and he visits the high priest. And the priest says to him, David asked for this holy bread. You can read about that holy bread in the book of Leviticus. But the priest says to him, this isn't for you, because that bread was typically for the priest and his household. The priest says to David, this is hallowed bread, but have you basically been set apart from your wives? And David says they've been set apart for 3 days. Now, this wasn't necessarily, from my vantage point, them deciding to do so in that sense. David was ultimately on the run, right? For my memory served me, his wife was left at home at that particular point. So there was no way he could do anything anyway. But David basically says he's been away for 3 days. And the reason I said this links into the Torah is because why would a priest be asking that question? Because like I explained to you, if David ultimately had been with his wife, he could be ceremonially unclean. And it would be an even bigger problem for him to ultimately eat that hallowed bread. So there are different examples of what may be considered seed retention, if that's how you kind of describe seed retention. From a single perspective, you shouldn't be engaging in sexual activities anyway. It's actually a sin. If you're married, the typical view is you can procreate, you can have that sort of fun with your marital partner, your spouse, but there are opportunities where you can decide if it's for prayer, if it's for fasting, it's for different things where you're both in agreement. One person can't just say, look, it's not going down for a week. That's not biblical, right? The two have to be in agreement and have to say, look, this is what the situation is, and for a season. And it basically even says in Corinthians ultimately that basically do it to a point where it doesn't get to a place where you're basically getting tempted based on what's ultimately going on. I'll show it to you right now. And it talks about here, the wife doesn't have power over her body, right? But the husband, so it's both of theirs. And likewise, right? So equality for man and wife in this particular scenario. Also, the husband has no power of his own body, but the wife, right? So the husband can't turn around and say, look, you're not getting any. The wife can't turn around and say, you're not getting any. And what does he say? Defraud ye not one the other, except with consent for a time. And notice this, he even calls it defrauding, right? So separating is some sort of defrauding, because you're married, you're free to ultimately engage in these particular things. What do you say? It only is done by consent, so you can only do this by consent for a time, right? If it is to fasting and prayer, and then you come together again, right? so you're not tempted through your lack of intimacy with your spouse. Any other scenario, you shouldn't obviously be engaging in any sort of activities. So hopefully that helps